Imagine you are at a dinner party in Paris, sometime in the 1770s. The air is thick with the scent of wine and roasted meat, and the conversation sparkles with wit and philosophy. You find yourself speaking to a man named Charles-Henri Sanson. He is charming, well-read, and discusses medicine with a startling expertise. He tells you of his private garden, his anatomical studies, his belief in science and reason. You are impressed. You ask him what he does for a living, this fascinating gentleman. He pauses. The warmth in his eyes cools just a fraction. He looks at you directly and says, with a quiet, unwavering dignity, "I am the executor of high works for the king and the city of Paris." A chill snakes through the room. The laughter falters. Executor of high works. It's a delicate, bureaucratic euphemism, a silken glove hiding a calloused, blood-stained hand. This man, this gentle intellectual, is the royal executioner. He is the bourreau, the man who breaks bodies on the wheel, who hangs, who beheads. He is the living embodiment of the state's most brutal power. To understand Charles-Henri Sanson, you have to understand that he never had a choice. His fate was sealed before he was born. The name Sanson wasn't just a name. It was a brand, a sixth-generation dynasty of death. The family business began in 1688 when Charles Sanson de Longueval, a gentleman soldier, took the post of executioner to marry the daughter of the previous one. From that moment on, the Sansons were locked in. The position of bourreau was hereditary, a title passed from father to son like a cursed crown. It was a trade, like being a baker or a blacksmith, but this trade came with a terrible price: total social ostracism. The Sansons were legally required to live in a specific house, set apart from the rest of Paris, a place the locals called the House of the Executioner. They were wealthy, the state paid them well for their gruesome services, but their money was tainted. Butchers would refuse their business, fearing their touch would spoil the meat. Priests would offer them communion on a separate wooden plate. They were living ghosts essential to the order of the kingdom, yet shunned by every level of society. Into this world, on the 15th of February 1739, Charles-Henri was born, and his father, Charles-Jean-Baptiste Sanson, was determined to give his son the one thing he never had: a way out. He used the family's blood money to give Charles-Henri the finest education imaginable. He was sent to a monastery school in Rouen, far from Paris, under an assumed name. There, the boy thrived. He was brilliant, with a particular love for the sciences, especially anatomy and medicine. He dreamed of becoming a doctor, a healer. He wanted to mend bodies, not break them. For a few precious years, he lived the life of a normal, promising young scholar. The dream was fragile, and one day it shattered. The father of another student discovered his true identity. The Sanson name, whispered in the schoolyard, became a contagion. Parents threatened to pull their children from the school. The headmaster, with deep regret, had to ask him to leave. The lie was over. Charles-Henri was forced to return to Paris, to the house that smelled faintly of metal and fear, to the future he had so desperately tried to outrun. His fate was sealed by a cruel twist of irony. His father, the current executioner, suffered a paralytic stroke while performing a horrific execution. He could no longer lift the heavy axe or pull the ropes of the rack. the state demanded a Sanson to fill the role. There was no one else. At just 18 years old, Charles-Henri, the boy who dreamed of being a doctor, had to put on the executioner's symbolic red coat. His first official act was to sign his father's letter of resignation and his own letter of appointment. The torch, heavy and blood-soaked, had been passed. His life became a walking paradox. By day, he studied his medical texts. He built a laboratory in his home. He cultivated a garden of medicinal herbs and provided free medical care to the poor of his neighborhood, the very people who spat on the ground as he passed. They would come to his door at night, ashamed but desperate, and the bureau would set their broken bones, treat their fevers, and deliver their babies. He saved lives quietly and without recognition. Then, when the summons came, he would put away his medical tools, don his official coat, and travel to the Place de Grève, the city's public square for executions. There, he would take lives publicly and with brutal efficiency. He was a man at war with himself, his identity split down the middle. One half a man of the Enlightenment, a believer in human dignity and progress. The other half, a medieval functionary, a dealer in ritualized violence. And in the France of the Ancien Régime, that violence could be truly unspeakable. On March 28, 1757, Charles-Henri Sanson, now a seasoned professional in his late teens, was tasked with the most horrific execution of his career. It would haunt him for the rest of his life. The condemned was a man named Robert-François Damiens. He had attempted to assassinate King Louis XV, though his attack was pathetically inept, a small penknife that barely pierced the king's thick winter clothes. But an attack on the king's body was an attack on the body of France itself. The punishment was designed not as justice, but as a terrifying spectacle of royal power. It was to be the ancient, medieval punishment for regicide. Imagine the scene. Damiens was brought to the scaffold. Sanson and his assistants, their faces grimly professional, went to work. First, the hand that held the knife was burned off with molten sulfur. You can imagine the smell, acrid smoke, burning flesh, mingling with the stench of the Parisian gutters. Then, using massive iron pincers, they tore flesh from his arms, legs, and chest. Into these gaping wounds, they poured a boiling concoction of lead, oil, and resin. Damiens somehow remained conscious, his screams echoing across the silent, horrified square. This was only the prelude. The final act was écartèlement, or quartering. 4 strong draft horses were harnessed to his limbs. Sanson gave the signal. The horses pulled. But Damiens' body wouldn't tear. His joints and ligaments were too strong. The crowd grew restless. The horses strained. For nearly an hour, this ghastly tug-of-war continued. Damiens was being stretched alive, a human rack. Charles-Henri, the man of science, the student of anatomy, knew this was failing. He saw the futility, the sheer butchery of it. This wasn't the clean, swift stroke he prided himself on. This was a mess. It was torture, not execution. Finally, he made a decision. He approached the court officials supervising the spectacle. He, the executioner, had to tell the magistrates how to properly dismember a man. He explained, with the cool precision of a surgeon, that they needed to sever the main joints with an axe first. Permission was granted. Sanson took up a long-bladed knife and an axe. He made the cuts.
Only then did the horses finally succeed in tearing the man apart. Charles-Henri went home that night and was violently ill.
He later wrote in his diaries, which may be partly apocryphal but capture his spirit perfectly, "My heart failed me. I could have wished that I had never been born." This event was a turning point. For Sanson, it crystallized the barbarism of his work. For France, it was one of the last gasps of medieval savagery masquerading as justice. The Enlightenment was dawning, and thinkers across Paris were disgusted by the Damiens affair. There had to be a better way, a more rational, more scientific, more humane way to kill a man. They just needed the right man and the right machine. And as the 1780s came to a close, a storm was gathering that would change everything. The revolution was coming, and Charles-Henri Sanson, the king's executioner, would soon find himself busier than he could have ever imagined. The world turned upside down. The cry of liberté, égalité, fraternité echoed from the streets of Paris. The absolute monarchy was crumbling, and a new National Assembly was forging a new France. In this frenzy of new ideas, one question arose: what to do about capital? Punishment? Many revolutionaries, like the idealistic Robespierre, initially wanted to abolish it entirely, but the reality of counter-revolution and political enemies made that impossible. So the question changed. If we must execute, how do we do it in a way that reflects our new, enlightened values? The old ways were a hierarchy of death. Nobles had the privilege of a quick beheading by sword. Commoners were hanged, a process that could lead to a slow, agonizing strangulation. The Damiens execution had shown the depths of royal cruelty. This inequality in death was offensive to the revolutionary spirit. Every citizen, whether a duke or a baker, should be equal, even on the scaffold. Enter Dr. Joseph Ignace Guillotine. Dr. Guillotine was not a monster. He was a humanitarian, a man of science, much like Sanson. He stood before the National Assembly and made a passionate plea. He argued for a single, painless method of execution for all citizens. He described a machine. "My machine will slice
Off your head in the twinkling of an eye, and you will feel nothing but a brief coolness on the back of your neck."
The idea was met with some nervous laughter, but it took root. A machine promised everything the revolution valued: equality, rationality, and efficiency. A committee was formed to build this new device. And who did they consult for his technical expertise on the mechanics of decapitation? The one man in France who knew the most about it, citizen Charles-Henri Sanson. Sanson, the executioner, became an unwilling consultant on the project. He reviewed the plans. He pointed out that a crescent-shaped blade, as originally proposed, might not work on all necks. He suggested a diagonal blade angled at 45 degrees for a cleaner, more certain cut. His grim expertise was now in service of progress. In April 1792, the first prototype was ready. It stood in a courtyard, a menacing wooden frame nearly 15 feet high. They tested it on live sheep, then on human corpses from a nearby hospital. Sanson supervised the tests, watching the weighted blade fall with a sickening thud. It worked perfectly. The press, with a taste for gallows humor, nicknamed the machine the guillotine. Dr. Guillotine was horrified. His name would be forever linked not with the humane impulse that drove him, but with the terror the machine would unleash. On April 25, 1792, the guillotine was used for the first time on a living criminal, a highwayman named Nicolas Pelletier. The crowd, accustomed to the long, dramatic spectacles of the past, was disappointed.
It was too fast. A pull of a rope, a flash of steel, a thud. It was over in seconds. There was no drama, no struggle. It was clinical, mechanical. Charles-Henri Sanson had a new tool. He no longer needed the heavy sword which could chip, or the uncertain noose.
He had a machine. A clean, efficient, rational machine for killing. He didn't know it yet, but he was about to become the high priest of a new national religion, and the guillotine was its altar. His first truly momentous victim was waiting on January the 21st, 1793. Charles-Henri Sanson was given the order he must have dreaded his entire life. He was to execute his own king. Louis XV had been tried and condemned to death by a single vote in the National Convention. For Sanson, this was not just another execution. This was the ultimate violation of the world he was born into. The Sansons were the king's executioners. Their authority, their very existence, flowed from the crown. Now the revolution was ordering him to sever that source. The morning was cold and foggy. A massive crowd, 80,000 strong, packed the former place Louis, Ponthève now renamed with chilling directness, the Place de la Révolution. They were eerily silent. This wasn't a mob baying for blood, it was a nation holding its breath. Sanson and his assistants met Louis at the foot of the scaffold. The former king was calm and dignified. He refused to have his hands tied. "I will not endure this outrage," he said. A brief, tense standoff followed. Sanson was caught between his orders and the man who was, until recently, God's anointed ruler of France. According to Sanson's own account, he leaned in and spoke to the king, not as an executioner to a victim, but as one man to another. He said, "Sire, we can tie your hands with this handkerchief," using a respectful title that was now illegal. It was a small, final act of deference. Louis, seeing the futility, relented. He was strapped to the bascule, the plank that would tip him forward into position. His last words were drowned out by a sudden drum roll, ordered by an impatient general. Sanson stood by the machine. He had checked the blade, the rope, the groove. Everything was ready. This had to be perfect. A mistake was unthinkable. He gave the signal. One of Sanson's young assistants, a boy named Gros, grabbed the head and held it up to the crowd for
a moment. There was still silence. Then a single voice cried out, "Vive la République!"
And the spell was broken. The crowd erupted. People surged forward, dipping handkerchiefs and scraps of paper in the king's blood, wanting a relic of this monumental event. Charles-Henri Sanson, the man who once studied medicine to save lives, had just decapitated the King of France. The revolution had its ultimate sacrifice, and the blood was just beginning to flow. The execution of the king opened the floodgates. With the old authority gone and France at war with all of Europe, the revolutionary government became radicalized. Paranoia became policy. A new phase began, the Reign of Terror. The Committee of Public Safety, led by Maximilien Robespierre, declared that terror is the order of the day. The guillotine was no longer just a tool of justice. It became an instrument, a political purification. Enemies of the revolution, real and imagined, had to be eliminated. For Charles-Henri Sanson, life became a nightmare. His work, once a rare and solemn ritual, became a relentless industrial process. He was no longer an executioner. He was the foreman of a slaughterhouse. Every day, the revolutionary tribunal would condemn dozens of people. Every day, the death carts, the tumbrils, would rumble through the streets of Paris, carrying the condemned from the conciergerie prison to the Place de la Révolution. Sanson would stand on the scaffold, list in hand, a clerk checking off names. Before sending them to their deaths, he had to hire more assistants, train them to work with speed and precision. The scaffold itself, soaked in blood, had to be scrubbed down daily and was eventually painted a deep, practical red to hide the
stains.
The ground around it became a stinking, muddy bog. The smell of death hung over the entire district. Think of the sheer scale. In the 40 years of his career before the Terror, Sanson had performed a few hundred executions. During the Terror, which lasted less than 2 years, he and his team would execute over 2,600 people in Paris alone. Let's make that concrete. At its peak, in the summer of 1794, the guillotine was executing up to 50 people a day. Imagine the rhythm of it. A cart arrives, a name is called. The victim is strapped down, the plank is tipped, whir, thud. The body is bundled into a wicker basket, the head into a leather sack. Next. Call the next name. Whir, thud. Next. One execution every 3 minutes. For hours on end, the psychological toll must have been unimaginable. This wasn't just an anonymous procession of criminals. These were the very people who had made the revolution. He executed the fiery orator Georges Danton, who on the scaffold famously told Sanson, "Show my head to the people, it is worth seeing." He executed the witty journalist Camille Desmoulins, who wept for his wife. He executed the radical Hébétists and the moderate Girondins. He executed aristocrats and commoners, nuns and prostitutes, scientists like Antoine Lavoisier, the father of modern chemistry. He executed Marie Antoinette, the Queen, who was dignified to the very end, accidentally stepping on his foot and saying, "Pardon me, monsieur, I did not do it on purpose." Even in her final moments, she saw him as a person, not a monster, addressing him with a formal politeness that must have struck him to the core. He was the one constant in the chaos, a neutral functionary of death, serving whichever faction held power. He was trapped. To refuse an execution was to be a traitor, to place his own head on the block. All he could do was perform his duty with the same grim professionalism, whether the victim was a king, a queen, or the very revolutionary who had sent them there. The snake was eating its own tail, and Charles-Henri Sanson was its fangs. The climax came in July 1794. The architect of the Terror, Maximilien Robespierre himself, was overthrown and condemned. And so the man who had overseen the entire bloody enterprise was brought before the executioner who had carried out his orders. Robespierre arrived at the scaffold with a shattered jaw from a botched suicide attempt. He was in agony, unable to speak. Sanson's men had to rip the bandage from his face to position him in the guillotine, causing him to let out a single animal scream of pain. Then the blade fell on the incorruptible. And with that thud, the reign of terror was effectively over. The crowd cheered louder for Robespierre's death than for any other. They were cheering for the end of the bloodletting, and no one could have been more relieved than the man who had been forced to preside over all of it. After Robespierre's fall, the pace of executions slowed to a trickle. The terror was over. France and Sanson were exhausted. In 1795, after nearly 40 years of service, he handed the family business over to his son, Henri, who had been his chief assistant throughout the Revolution. Charles-Henri retired. He finally had what he always wanted, a quiet life. He returned to his house, to his books, and to his beloved garden. He tried to live as a simple, private citizen. But you cannot simply wash that much blood off your hands. He was a man haunted by 1,000 ghosts. He was recognized on the street, pointed at, whispered about. He was the face of the terror, even though he was just its instrument. He spent his final years trying to make sense of his life, trying to justify the role he had been forced to play. It was during this time that his famous memoirs were likely compiled, perhaps heavily embellished by writers later on, but they capture the essential conflict of his soul. They are the writings of a man desperate to be seen as more than just the bourreau. He describes his compassion, his disgust at the cruelty, his belief in his own professionalism as a form of mercy. There's a famous, though likely apocryphal story from this period. One day, the most powerful man in France, Napoleon Bonaparte, disguised himself and sought out the retired executioner. He wanted to ask him a question that obsessed him. How could Sanson have possibly slept at night after executing King Louis? Silly Tiger Sanson, according to the legend, looked the future emperor in the eye and replied, "If you emperors, kings and republics thought a little less about having us kill and a little more about governing, you would sleep much better." And so would Charles-Henri Sanson died in 1806 at the age of 67. He was buried in the Montmartre cemetery where his family plot remains to this day. His son and grandson continued the family trade until the position was finally abolished in 1840, ending the Sanson dynasty. So how do we remember this man? He was not a sadist, he was not a fanatic. He was, by all accounts, a quiet, intelligent, and even compassionate man cursed by his ancestry. His life is a profound and disturbing story about the nature of duty, complicity, and the terrible things people can do when they believe they are serving a higher cause, or simply have no other choice. He was a man of the Enlightenment, a lover of science and reason, who was forced to become the operator of the most brutally efficient killing machine the world had ever seen. A machine born, ironically, from those same Enlightenment ideals. The tragedy of Charles-Henri Sanson is not that he was a monster, but that he was so painfully human. He was trapped by a system, first by the ancient traditions of the monarchy and then by the remorseless logic of the revolution. He had to look every victim in the eye, from the king to the queen to the revolutionaries who condemned them. He was the final, sober witness to the madness. His story is a chilling reminder that the greatest horrors are often not committed by fanatics foaming at the mouth, but by quiet, dutiful men just doing their jobs, their hands forced by history, their souls slowly ground to dust by the terrible, relentless weight of what they have to do.